Welcome to this week's Rising Tide Foundation study group, where we are now beginning the third reading of Kepler's Harmonies of the World, where we are now beginning chapter 2 of book 4 on Kepler's Metaphysics. I prepared, like usual, I prepared a few slides briefly just to set people's minds and or maybe thinking about this from the standpoint of tuning people's minds to some of the concepts that we're going to go into. Is something we're about to experience. Also, there were a few people who submitted some hypotheses, some constructions over the course of the week regarding the building up of some of these elementary figures. So I wanted to just go through a few of them, look at them, talk about them very quickly before we look at the slideshow. So let's look at some of that. 1 second here. Okay, can people see this screen? Mm-hmm. All right. So here we have a submission by Paul. Now, Paul admittedly was in a tough position because he's caught in the Philippines without a quality compass, so he couldn't really do the construction. So Paul sort of eyeballed a few things. Paul, we got to figure out a way to get you a high quality compass so that you could do the work.
I'll put the word out amongst a few friends. I might be able to get one that way. Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool.
And look, Matthew, there probably are shops here that sell decent ones. It's just they're not going to be easy to find, and all of that sort of stuff. And
that's fine.
My submissions were all done yesterday.
Paul, don't stress it, man. We'll find a way. We'll find a way.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, can people see the hexagram image here? No.
No. Okay. Triangle.
Still a triangle. Okay. So it is giving me a bit of a hard time. All right. So here, let's just skip around here. What I have here is a beautiful construction by Declan. Declan did something really elegant. He's unfortunately practicing for a performance of Shakespeare right now, so he couldn't be with us today, but he did send in some photographs of his constructions. What Declan did, actually here, let's get back to Declan's afterwards, because I want to first show something else. So here, sorry, what was that? Was that something? Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm speaking a little bit loud. So what I have here from Declan was his first construction, featuring his building up of the triangle as well as the hexagon. I would imagine that based upon his construction of the 6 circles around his original core circle, that he probably built the hexagon first, right? And it doesn't take people very long, usually playing around with the first circle and that you build with your compass, to discover that just by rotating the radius around the circumference of that first circle, you quickly find that you encounter the discovery of the hexagon. That's usually the simplest and most easy to access discovery. And then Declan seems to have very quickly discovered that you could simply connect every second vertices of the hexagon, and he found very conveniently that there's inside of there an equilateral triangle that divides that circle up into 3. He was nice enough to even put the internal angles of 60 degrees onto the internal angles of the triangle. So he definitely has an elegant proof there. Stephen. Oh, can people see Stephen's construction? Yeah. This is a nice little construction of the octagon. And Stephen, Stephen, are you there right now?
I am. Let me see if I show up here on the video too.
Yeah. Oops. Is this also you, Stephen?
Yeah, that's me. So the basically that takes a square, and you just bisect each of the 4 sides to get the points, the 4 additional points you need to make the 8-sided figure or the octagon.
Yeah. And you erase the internal square inside of there, I can see, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just let some people in here. This, I'm not going to ask you how you did it, but I want people who have not yet figured this out to think about bisecting a line, because part of the construction that Stephen used is the bisection of a line. If you want to get an octagon and all you figured out is the square, you definitely would want to figure out how do you cut a line into 2 equal segments using only the compass to guide you, right? To make it perfect. That's something that people definitely want to think about. Stephen knows this. Stephen, right here, what's this?
So I think it's called the Vesica Pisces when you
Pisces, yeah.
yeah when you make a circle of equal radius on the circumference of the original circle,
Mhm.
and then at each point where it intersects, you just repeat it. So I'm just trying to think. You come up with 6, and then if you do the bisector thing again, you can get 12.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's
The
pretty much what you did.
bisector. Yeah.
Yeah, so you wrapped around, you created your hexagon, and then you started bisecting each of the sides to make to discover a dodecagon. That's
Yep.
great. That's really good. Okay.
I think that one's the basis to a lot of stuff that is found in ancient parts of the world. It's filled in with all of the the circular bits there, etc., etc. So I think it has a name. It's
Well, there's the flower of life as well.
flower of life. That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, this is something that all civilizations, it's a natural thing for the human mind to quickly encounter this relationship of the circle to itself with certain proportions. It's very natural. And sometimes people overly mystify this into the like numerological wasteland, which gets a little ungrounded, let's just say sometimes. But yeah, you see it in architecture, you see it in every civilization that's dealt with this, and certain relationships internally arise regarding internal angles. So the dodecagon is a great one. Oh, what's this? What was this? This is Stephen's square, triangle, and hexagon
That's
basics.
The top
Yep.
one is the square, and that if you basically take a line drawn through the center that bisects the circle into semicircles, then you take perpendicular bisector to that line. So you basically have a right angle cross in the middle, for lack of a better term. It'll intersect the circle at 4 points, equally distributed, and that gives you your square.
Perfect. Yeah, that's the simplest way. There is another way to build the square, and we're going to see that, but that is a really simple, elegant way to do it. Then you got the triangle there. You just overlap 2 equal triangles along the common radius, and you found that new distance creates a new relationship that conveniently happens to be the equilateral triangle. Very nice. And then there's your hexagon again. Okay, these are all good. Who's this? Is Paul's hexagon? Yeah, so Paul had to unfortunately eyeball it this time around, but again, we're going to get Paul a high quality compass. And keep in mind, Paul, the internal angles at each of the letters is probably not 60 degrees, okay?
Okay.
You see why it's not 60 degrees?
Not off the top of my head, no.
Well,
I mean, remember how I did this? I mean, I was just desperate for a result, so I grabbed the protractor and just started dividing circles into degrees.
Just for the sake of an exercise mentally, if you
They should be 120. Those.
Well, do it in the form of a question, John. So yeah, like if you
start with a triangle, you get 180 degrees. Then you move on to the square, you get 360. You keep adding 180. So then you get you get 540 in the pentagon, and then you get 720 in the hexagon. And so you divide 720 by 6, and you get 120 each.
Yeah, but
I think what he's saying there is that each 2 consecutive points subtends an angle of 60 degrees.
It's the arc. It's the arc on the circumference.
Yeah.
Oh, the arc on the circumference is.
As you can see, that's what
yeah, Paul,
that's what I've written there. That's what I've written there.
Arc. Okay, I misread that. Paul, that is perfect, dude. Keep it up. Okay, good job. Okay, good. This is still Paul's. Okay, yeah, I eyeballed the pentagon there. Okay, Kelly had a couple of constructions. Kelly, what are we looking at there?
What are we looking at?
I mean, it's clearly the triangle.
Yeah, I was just enjoying playing around with arcs. I was trying more or less to stay in, to work inside the circle instead of making my points outside the circle. That's just one of these little rules I made for myself.
That's
but
a
it
good
turns
rule.
well, it helps me learn certain things, but there there's difficulties working inside the circle, put it that way.
Did you build up the hexagon first, or did you build up something else like the circle, the triangle first before the hexagon? Because I see the hexagon is in there. Did you do that first?
I did the no, I would have done the probably bisected the line first.
You're
And,
talking. It says this is the main line.
Yeah.
Going vertical. Are you saying that that's the line you would have bisected first?
Well, I made several drawings. That particular one, geez, I can't remember. But the way I would do it, I would just, before I even draw the circle, I would just make a line, like a straight line, and then pick a point on the line to do my circle.
Mhm.
And then from there, I just make a series of arcs and then figure out the triangle. And then the square, well, I'm learning
I think
it's
the
the
food's
easiest way
ready.
to do the square is, like you said, to bisect.
Huh?
You did figure out how to bisect, Kelly, a line by.
Yeah,
I don't need to
actually, yeah,
participate.
that's quite easy. I was trying something different.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure the method that I was
Okay.
playing with is as very accurate, but it helps me learn with. I guess I'm trying to understand ratios and stuff like that.
Okay. Well, I'd like to have maybe a sit down with you on the side maybe this week, and you can take me through it a little bit more personally, just because I'm curious about some of your choices that you were making. Like in this one, where you have two different squares that you built up, which
Yeah.
together connect to make the octagon, and you also have the hexagon that you put inside here. I'm curious to see what came first. Was it the hexagon that came first, or did you? Was it
No,
one of
I
the
would have done the square with the horizontal line square. That would have been the first one. Whereas if you were bisecting, I would have probably done the diagonal square first. But in this particular one, it was the square that's more horizontal and vertical. That
And-
one I did first, and then
Okay.
it's sort of kind of backwards, I guess.
Okay, and I guess I'm curious to know how you made your decisions to position the square the way you did, because how do you know that they look really good, both squares, but I'm just curious how you selected these moments at each corner to ensure that they were perfectly square.
Yeah. Well, I made arcs that were I don't know how to explain it. Like, you see the kind of flower structure on there.
Well, that's the hexagon, yeah.
And oh geez. There's so many angles in there. I took the length of between the two florets. That would be the construction of the triangle, and I used that as a measurement to do just a series of arcs in the diagram, and then just to see where I'd end up in it. And it showed that it formed intersections where the square should be. So I just drew the lines in and then kind of measured it out.
Okay, it's that last part that confuses me. So you and I are gonna have to set up a separate Zoom maybe tomorrow, and you're gonna take me through this, and then next week we'll reevaluate that, because there's a leap that's being made I just can't quite follow.
Okay.
Let's skip that one for now as well. That's Yuval Harari. Ignore that. Now let's just go back here. Declan's I thought was really nice. So again, clear what Declan did there regarding the triangle and hexagon. Now, Declan constructed the square in a very unique way. It's very nice. It's obviously a little bit less direct than what Stephen did, when Stephen just simply bisected the diagonal. Now, what Declan did is he first constructed the hexagon, and then he doubled the lines of the hexagon to make a dodecagon, and discovered that within the 12-sided, because this is an image with 12 sides, right? Then he discovered that, well, 4 divides into 12 very nicely. And so he was able to connect every third vertices of the dodecagon with a line, generating a square. and you could do 3 separate squares rotating inside of that very nicely, very, very nicely. So that was a very elegant proof. I enjoyed it, and he did demonstrate that he knows how to bisect the line too, by virtue of having made the dodecagon. So that was fantastic. So that's good. The big challenging thing now is for people to think about the pentagon construction, and to also hold in mind that when one builds up the square or the triangle, that there's 2 separate qualitative actions in the creation of the square and of the triangle. They're not the same species of geometric action that brings them into being from not being. And when people do start discovering the pentagon's construction, think about what is different from the triangle and the square, which is now happening in the creation of the pentagon, which will involve a little bit of an exploration into the golden section, which deals with, something that's known as the square root of 5 minus 1 over a number, 2 usually. That will be something that we think about geometrically in its construction. But once you have them, you can then double the sides using the same quality of bisection. So you could double the sides of the triangle to make 6, 12, 24 infinitely. So you have one series of infinites from the 3 to 6, 12, right? And all the doubling that goes on. Or the square to the octagon to the 16 to the 32 and on to infinity. You can keep doing that doubling of the sides for a different species of infinite. It's not the same infinite because they're rooted in 2 separate originating geometries of creation. And the same thing for the pentagon, tanagon, 20, 40, 80 onward to infinity. It's yet another species. Now, for people who remembered what Quan went through in the Theaetetus dialogue by Plato, 2 reading sessions or 2 reading projects ago, the Theaetetus features an exploration of this very idea in the form of the 3 species of number, oblong square numbers, and another type of number that isn't dealt with too much, but what is effectively prime numbers, right? Numbers that can only be divided by themselves and 1. So these 3 species of number, when treated not simply as quantity, but as qualities of creation, we see something that that gives us a key into what would be the physical process that the mind can discover in reality that is causing these geometries to come into being qualitatively, right? Out of which number is given meaning. So it's a way to sort of cure a lot of people from the problems of numerology, which sort of contaminate a lot of the thinking of sacred geometry discussions and things of the sort. So let me just stop this. The second thing I want to, so good job, guys. Anybody who wants to keep on doing some geometry work, please keep sending me pictures of your research and of your constructions. The second thing I want to do here. So I made a little brief slideshow. This will involve a bit of music. Can people see this PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay. I'm not a big fan of somebody putting the continent of Africa around the golden section or the Fibonacci sequence, but they did it. Whatever, it's okay. Maybe there's something to it, I don't know. But there's definitely something that we see as an organized geometry in all of nature on the macro and the micro, in living and in non-living nature. So that's an interesting thing. We note that you have 2 different kinds of geometry, right? The kind we've been dealing with here on the right side is the geometry of the mind. So the core elementary shapes that are beyond the material world, but seem to have some relationship with the material world, right? The hexagon is not something which we ever see in nature as a pure form, but we see the blueprint of the hexagon organizing the fabric of nature and of atomic growth. In this case, we got the famous snowflakes, 6-sided snowflakes, right? All of them different, yet all of them maintaining the constancy of having 6 sides. None of them being the perfect equal 60-degree angles from internally, but all very close. That's interesting.
Don't we see the same thing with beehives?
Yes, you saw this if you do a cross section of a beehive, sure.
Yeah.
But a beehive as well is three-dimensional. So if you take any of the internal units within the beehive, you get a 30-sided, what's called a it's called a dodecahedron, not a dodecahedron, a rhombic dodecahedron. That's it.
Yeah.
But if you do a cross section of a pomegranate or a beehive, yeah, you get the cross section of the hexagon. So the question is always, what's the difference and what's the same between the pure form itself that the mind sees through a construction that it can understand through the act of reasoning its way through it, that sees the side of the hexagon and recognizes that it's the radius of the circle that it's inscribed within, and can prove it, versus the identification of the hexagonal form when looking through nature. Right. Same thing here. We see the same evidence of equilateral triangles expressing themselves in the organizational flow of there's a few examples of some very pretty flowers. Right. Same thing for squares are a little bit harder to find. There are some examples of fourfold symmetries in flowers, but very hard to find, very much more rare. They've got the four-leaf clover after all. But you do see a lot of cases of pyrite showing up in cubes. That's interesting. Or in the top right-hand side, there is sodium chloride cubes that just form. It says something about the nature of the atomic structure that's choosing to form in these very clear geometries.
There are some natural formations that have squares or whatever. There's a fairly famous one, I think, off the coast of Western Australia.
Mm.
And
Like a rock formation,
it's a rock formation. It's on the shore, and when you look at it, it looks man-made.
Mm.
But it's not, and it's extremely old, is what I understand.
Well, that's cool. Yeah, there's it's good to make like a list of all of the cool geometries that are 3D or 2D that we find in nature, and always ask, how does the thesis of randomness of hold up that is part of the standard model quantum mechanics that we're supposed to assume is embedded in all of discoverable nature, which is randomness. How does that hold up to what we see with these very beautiful symmetries? Case in point, again, the golden section, which is something which really we tend to only find in natural form. Like fivefold symmetries occur all over the place in living matter.
Is that okra? Is that okra?
Yeah.
Okay. Next time I eat okra, I'm gonna really take a look. That's cool.
Yeah, really, really appreciate what's coming in. Yeah.
Very, very common vegetable here in Manila.
Well, this is, it's just, there's these beautiful things, right? You got starfish too. Da Vinci was obviously looking at the golden section, organizing the Vitruvian Man. He was part of a larger exploration of the golden section in living matter. Here's some examples of radiolaria on the. Do I have an example of pollen there? Oh, I don't have my pollen example. Damn, there's a beautiful pollen, molecular pollen, which is also a dodecahedron, which is interesting. These do derive from organic matter. In all cases, I don't know the backstory, but you do see this more on the microscopic level, the dodecahedron formation. But it's there. I think there's one thing. What is it called? Alum. There's one not inorganic subatomic molecule of something that's tied to alum, which does show up as a dodecahedron, which doesn't appear to be living, but that's the only one. Everything else tends to always involve some organic matter. So again, you see these beautiful geometries, and again, it forces us to re-question: well, is the chaos randomness thesis of science true or not? So obviously, we're here because we've already discovered that it's bunk. There's an organizing principle of beauty in the universe, but it's nice that it can be proven. It's not just an act of faith, which is cool. Do people, oopsie daisy. Last thing I'm going to show here, because we're talking about the harmonies of the world, which is also audible harmonies, sound, right? Geometries of sound. So let me just do a quick thing here. All right. Have people seen this cool video of the Japanese scuttlefish or the
Mhm.
pufferfish? The artistic fish.
No.
It's pretty cool. You see these qualities of symmetries and
Forbidden
geometries.
knowledge. 528 DNA.
Not such a big fan of the background music right now. That one. So this is part of the mating procedure of the Japanese blowfish. Oh, sorry, pufferfish, not blowfish. It's something which evolutionarily developed in this
Forbidden
species
knowledge.
as part of the mating process to create these little symmetrical, beautiful productions in the sand. It's astounding, right? And they
You have
keep on
to
having to
wonder- you
rub
have
their
to-
body into it because the current of the water causes it to disappear. So they have to keep on reproducing this very elegant, organized geometry, which you can even see has a bit of a, I'm not sure if that's a pentagon or not. Anyway, definitely something to it, right?
You have to wonder what the template is in their mind, don't you?
Yeah, it's definitely something they're not thinking about the type of discussions of causality of geometry the way we can do, but there's definitely something embedded in their nature, in their being, that is expressing these fundamental, beautiful archetypes. So that's something else.
My first thought was that, could they possibly be reading magnetic lines of some kind?
Yeah, maybe, probably. I mean, this is part of the
I mean, so many animals do.
yeah, and magnetic fields have resonance. That also implies degrees of harmonics when you're dealing with that sort of thing. So yeah, there's another case where there's thousands of these beautiful videos of musicians going to farm country and just playing for cows and sheep and pigs and donkeys. And just what you always tend to find is that these animals love music. Ignore the pooping. Their tails are going nuts. They really enjoy music.
I think I've seen one where a bunch of trombonists did this and the cow started mooing along.
Yeah, I saw the same thing. There's also elephants that come over to a piano and
Oh,
just
yeah.
swaying
Yeah.
along with the piano playing. Yeah, it's nice. So you definitely have something that they're resonating to internally, right? Even though they're not going to think about what are the geometries of harmonics that are coming into their senses and being received by their souls. They just like it. And the last thing here I wanted to show for humans, I don't know if the sound quality is going to come out too well here. This is Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. Kepler was part of a chorus. He actually spent years and years working with choruses. So he had part of his scientific work was really animated by his immersion into music. It's an important concept to hold in mind. You hear that? Sorry, I just realized that I don't want it to run too long, but I'm going to make sure that everyone gets a copy of this. Now, were people able to hear the music a little bit?
Certainly, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay.
And listen, if you want to go one step further with this, Matthew,
Yep.
Find some really good organ music played in some of the organs that are literally embedded in the church structures.
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
organs are all based on resonance, you know, all of the stops and everything like that. There are geometric proportions everywhere in the way an organ works. So
Yeah,
it's a very appropriate thing to do.
absolutely. And I was thinking about some Bach's some Bach pieces on the organ, but I figured we don't have too much time. But I do think that that's a great thing, and especially being in a church that has a built-in organ, if people can access that, performed with a good musician is really great. Now,
And if you're going to do the organ thing, start with Bach.
Yes. I was going to play a couple of random things, some atonal music by Schoenberg, but I'm not going to do that because I think we all have a sense that there is an attack on harmony and of beauty in postmodernism, which is kind of slapped into the 20th century, and really is based on philosophically the view that sound is just sound, regardless of what is organizing the sound. And so people could say that, you know, like there's a whole field of experimental music, different sounds of cities, right? All sound frequencies coming at us, horns honking in the background, cars, right? Ambient noise. And one could say if you're just a mathematician, you'd be like, well, it's all the same as Mozart or Bach. Right? It's just frequency of sound coming into your ears. That's all it is. It's all equal. It doesn't matter. It's just your taste, your personal opinion that Mozart might be more beautiful, but it's really not intrinsically true.
Sounds like a John Cage composition.
Yeah. So Kepler is going to talk about all these things. I did all of this for a reason, because it'll help sort of make sense of some of the Kepler language that we're going to go through in the coming few pages. And it's a short chapter. So, all right.
It's an interesting synchronicity, isn't it? All of the stuff that we're doing right at the moment. I'm just coming off having done a performance of free jazz improvisation.
How'd that go?
Yeah, well, there was a guy that came, I mean, it was a friend of mine who's steeped in it, you know, and I did it because he's a friend. It's not something I would normally sign up for, but there was a Japanese bass player that came across who you know, played this bass instrument through a bunch of electronic equipment. All it was just drone, 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 drone. You know, I mean, trying to find a point of reference, you know, if you're trying to improvise freely, you need to have something that inspires you to want to make a sound. And if all you're hearing is drone, 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 drone the whole time, it's like, well, what do I do on the drum set?
Were you able to sort of fake it and make it?
Well, here's the weird thing. There was a bigger audience at the jazz club that we played at than they've had for a while. And people afterwards were simply saying, oh, that was far and away the best free jazz performance we've heard. Okay. Amazing, because I can tell you that none of us had any idea what we were going to do before we actually got up on stage. A fun experience.
Do you feel like you brought in some of your internal instincts for harmony into your improv that shaped things a little bit?
Essentially, you have, you know, the guy that I was doing it with, the guy that is steeped in this, you know, there are three ways to respond. You can either complement the sounds that you're hearing, try and create something contrasting, or simply go to another space. Just do something completely random, if you like. A friend of mine from America asked me, you know, I put it up on Facebook because I knew people would be interested, some of it anyway. He asked me, what were you thinking? You know, how did you respond? How did you decide what you were going to do? And I simply said, look, it was intense listening. Whatever I heard the sax player do in particular, that was my inspiration to try and do something. And sometimes, you know, you try and complement, you try and play something that is similar to what you're hearing. Sometimes you deliberately contrast, you know, if he's playing a lot of long sounds, you'll do a lot of short sounds or whatever. And sometimes you just say, I've had enough of this, I'm just going to go feral. Which takes the music in a whole different direction. But I mean, you know, the audience loved it. So there's no accounting for taste.
Cool.
I mean, I've had discussions with the guy that asked me about this, and I'm quite free with him. I tell him exactly what I think. I don't pander to his ego simply because I'm a friend. And he understands. He was happy in, you know, insofar as the performance was well received, but he also agreed that the bass player left a lot to be desired in terms of inspiring other players there to do something interesting and creative. He
Right.
really wasn't. You couldn't hang your hat on it. Anyway, enough of that. I don't want to dominate
Cool.
this.
For today, so yeah, let's move through some Kepler. Now, do people generally remember the gist of what we looked at last week regarding the sensual versus the essence of harmonies, and specifically why Kepler called for the banning of Aristotle from all of Christendom? What was Kepler's line of reasoning when he said Aristotle should have no place in the Christian world?
I forget the specific reasons. Even though I read it, I mean, you know, my concentration was just on being able to read it accurately last week. So perhaps I didn't take as much of it in as I'd like to.
Well, maybe starting with what you said, Matt, that Aristotle would not have a place in the Keplerian world. The infamous statement by Aristotle is precisely that our mind is a blank slate, and on contrary, in the Platonic and Keplerian world, our mind is far to be a blank slate, but have in the soul, there are stuff which existed, and I quote Kepler by memory, in the incorporeal and unlocalized mode. I like very much that expression. I repeat it, in an incorporeal and unlocalized mode. And precisely, it was the comparison between the presence of the soul, which process the emanations from things, and the presence of the soul, which process not the emanations of sensible things, but which process precisely those incorporeal and unlocalized modes of reality within the soul. And here he talked about the harmonic proportions of intelligible mode, meaning that you have the soul, but the two items are not two objects from external reality and their sensible emanations, but the two items were precisely object within the soul, and it is precisely the harmonic proportions coming from the idea in the meaning of eidos form within the soul, of the circles and the arcs for one of the item, and the second item to be correlated by the soul precisely are the lines of possible polygons. And that's what are the heart of the exercises that you were presenting at the beginning of the video.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's good. So we're going to continue that exploration right now. That we've got a sense of the essences of the harmonies outside of us, and how they shape the pattern of what is embedded within the soul, which is a reflection of the entire universe, and the quantization that is discoverable of the universe between the one and the infinite. So between the leap from, you know, the oneness that is everything and in everything, you have also an infinite divisibility, but between those two, you have a discoverable set of quantized relationships in everything. Everything, which is because everything is harmony, right? Everything is organized by magnetic fields, light fields, sound fields, all sorts of things that emit harmonic relationships when thought about from a non-simply or simple-minded materialist perspective. So now we're going to continue looking at the question of the deeper quality of number, the quality shaping number, and the kinds of faculties of the soul in accordance with the harmonies. So we'll need a reader for today. Who wants to pick it up?
I guess I should do it, being as nobody else wants to. I'll try it. How's that?
Go for it.
Okay.
Well done, Helene.
All right. The number and kind of the faculties of the soul in accordance with the harmonies. We have said so far of the harmonic proportions, what they are and where they are located. But we do not seem yet to have touched on the question which is appropriate for our intention, because it relates not so much to the harmonic proportions themselves as to the harmonic faculty of the soul. That is to say, the faculty for acting in accordance with the proportions. So far, then, we have dealt with the proportions from the point of view of their own essence. Now we must deal with those proportions from the point of view of the soul itself. Now there arises a twofold faculty in connection with the harmonic proportions, one contemplative, which is mental or so in a sense, and the other operative. And the mental one is again twofold, for either it is for discovering the actual proportions in abstract quantities, or it is for recognizing or noticing the chosen proportions in sensible things. Then the faculty which hunts for harmonic ratios is the same as that which also embraces the remaining branches of knowledge and the arts. That is to say, the higher part of the human mind. For nothing is said here about God inasmuch as it does not hunt for him by contemplation and study, but knows him from eternity. That faculty which notices and recognizes the noble proportions in sensible things, or even in other things established outside itself, is a lower faculty of the soul, giving form to the senses from close to, or yet lower. That is to say, only the vital faculty of the soul, that is one which neither contemplates, as is the habit of philosophers, or uses logic for this purpose, and does not exist only in man, but also in wild beasts and cattle, and the sublunary soul. Is that right? Sublunary?
Yes.
Okay. You may ask if it is capable, you may ask if it is not capable of contemplation, and that means it would not be able to grasp knowledge of the harmonic proportions from which it would have the ability to recognize them when they were proffered. Is that what that is? Proffered from without. For to recognize is to compare some external sensible thing with ideas which are internal, and to judge that they are congruent. That is splendidly expressed by Proclus by the term awakening, as if from sleep. For just as sensible things which we meet externally make us recollect what we had known beforehand, similarly sensible mathematical things, if they are recognized, therefore elicit intellectual things which are previously present within, so that things now in actuality shine forth in the soul which were hidden in it before, as if under a veil of potential. What is that?
Yeah, I think this one is potentiality.
Potentiality? Is that what it is? Okay. How then did they break in? I reply that the ideas or formal causes of the harmonies, in accordance with our earlier discussion of them, are completely innate in those who possess this power of recognition, but they are not, after all, taken within them by contemplation, but rather depend on a natural instinct and are innate in them, as the number, something intellectual, of the leaves in the flower and of the segments in a fruit are innate in the forms of plants. The result of this finding in plants resembling the harmonic ratios, for number and proportion are akin, as was made clear above, is that I cannot confidently deny even to the vegetative faculty of the soul and to the plants themselves the power of recognizing the harmonic proportions of the sidereal rays.
Yeah, that's simply the angular relationships of the various planets or the sun to each other. So,
Is
you know,
it
you have,
sidereal or sidereal?
I say
Sidereal.
Sidereal. Okay.
Oh, sidereal, okay. Well, assert nothing without appropriate test. It therefore turns out that primitives, peasants, and barbarians, and the very wild beasts perceive harmonies in notes, though they know nothing about the theory of harmony. But if you were to ask whence they get this instinct, I shall either take refuge in God, who shapes and imposes on bodies these forms, all images of himself, though more or less close, and makes them display the harmonic ratios in themselves, just as he has embraced them in his mind from eternity and has expressed them in his creation, as has been stated above, or else, which comes to the same thing, I shall adduce the affinity touched on in chapter 1 of these souls, even the inferior ones, with the circle, in accordance with which, as with a rule or law that has been arranged and shaped, while along with the circle and its constructibility, they have also taken on the idea of the harmonic proportions which depend on it. For this philosophy is strongly confirmed by horoscopes, as we see that the character of the concurrence of celestial rays at the same point, as if from a common circle, is imprinted on the mind of the newborn. More on this will follow in chapter 7.
I think that this is one of the few places I kind of appreciate the footnote, even though I'm not a big fan of the
You
translator.
want me to read the horoscopes down there?
Yeah,
Is that
sure.
what
Or
you're talking
do we want to get somebody else to read the footnotes? This will
happily
be
do
the only
that.
footnote. Okay, Paul. So this is probably going to be the only footnote we read in this section, but go for it.
Okay. Horoscopes, which take their name from the ascendant, horoscopus. The ascendant, by the way, is the point at which the sun is rising on the horizon when you're born. The degree of the zodiac rising above the, well, I spoke too soon. The degree of the zodiac rising above the horizon at the moment of birth invoked much else beside the influence of the aspects that was accepted by Kepler. Of judicial astrology in general, he remarked that it was like the stupid daughter who, thanks to her incantations, clothes, and feeds her mother astronomy, who is as wise as she is poor. See Tertius Interveniens, Thesis 7, KGW 4, page 161. Indeed, Kepler owed his own positions to his employer's interest in astrology. The writing of horoscopes and prognostications of events was part of his official duties. Among the Kepler manuscripts in Leningrad are some 800 horoscope diagrams in which he has written in dates and the corresponding positions of the planets, though only a few are accompanied by interpretations. See List, 1971, page 129. Some of his forecasts of events were in fact remarkably successful and served to enhance his reputation. In his Prognosticum for 1618, KOF, volume 1, page 481, pages 481 to 483, for example, he predicted great upheavals in the world in May, and on 23rd May of that year, the 30 Years' War started, when 2 Prague councillors were thrown from the windows of the town hall. Kepler's most famous horoscope was the one that he wrote for his patron, Albrecht von Wallenstein, in 1608, KOF, volume 1, pages 386 to 391. Later, in 1625, interpreting the horoscope at Wallenstein's request, Kepler predicted that in March 1634, there would be a terrible confusion in the country that would affect him. In fact, Wallenstein was assassinated on 25th February 1634. The augmented horoscope may be found in KOF volume 8, pages 348 to 358. If Kepler had lived to see this prediction come to pass, he would have judged it to be merely a coincidence. When he appended to his horoscope the remark, I have only devised horoscopes when I was sure that my work was intended for somebody who understands philosophy and is not affected by contradictory superstition. KOF volume 8, page 348. It seems clear that he would have preferred Wallenstein not to take it seriously, though he was not in a position to question his powerful patron's faith in astrology.
Yeah, I thought that that was a useful observation because a lot of people say Kepler was a superstitious astrologer and actually they don't actually read Kepler's writings where they would quickly discover that he was in a world of high level superstition where he had to be proficient at this sort of thing, and that's how he paid his bills. But that was not at all what. And well, we're going to see more of this. Kepler's going to take direct aim at the entire school of astrology very shortly, in a very, very elegant way. I lost the where was the
It starts furthermore, the media.
oh, it's here, right? Okay, yeah.
Okay. You want me to continue?
Yeah.
Okay. Furthermore, the media which these lower faculties of the soul use to perceive harmonies in externals are the same by which they also take the actual external objects within themselves. If they are sensible, they are also perceived by the senses, that is to say, by the faculties of the soul which give shape to the senses, and which themselves also are no less occupied than the higher faculty in the comparison of particular things, but by instinct, not by contemplation. So by the hearing of a sound and by the power which controls it, consonances are distinguished from dissonances. So architectonic proportions are perceived by the eyes and by that faculty which controls the sight. Beautiful and congruous proportions are distinguished from the incongruous. However, if the things themselves in which the harmonic ratio exists are not sensible, but happen to be perceivable by another faculty, by the same faculty also the actual proportions of things shine out in the soul, just as was found by comparison with the proportions of the
Sidereal.
Say it again.
Sidereal.
Sidereal rays. How those are perceived by the sublunary soul, we shall inquire below in chapter 7. However, this perception of the harmonies in the inferior faculties of the soul is dull and dim, and in a sense material and under a cloud of ignorance, for they do not know that they perceive as when we see something, but do not notice that we are seeing it. Such are those emotions and terrors so celebrated by the Stoics, which are natural and unintentional and involuntary, such as is the nature feeling of hate or love, especially with a remarkable predisposition as judging the goodness of another soul or its resemblance to one's own by the symmetry of the parts of the body and the qualities of the voice and temperament. He is wonderfully inflamed towards it. Therefore, the crazy youth loves the girl, and he does not know why nor what he loves in her most of all, because no courtesan whom he meets can surpass her. If it is an improper love, nor can any marriageable girl if it is a legitimate one. But if a
Physiognomist.
Physiognomist.
Okay, but if a
Physiognomist.
physiognomist comes on the scene, he finds in both personalities some resemblance of character, and if the characters are defective, they give occasion for perpetual strife in the marriage. But if they are good, for perpetual tranquility in the life. So we must attribute to this the universal physiognomic instinct, as although it is dumb and in a sense irrational, as it is hardly at all acquired by art, though it can be developed by it. Yet it is a unique interpreter and umpire of human affairs. For a man attains prosperity, speaking naturally, to the extent to which his appearance, the symmetry of his body, the gait and motion of his limbs smile to those who are in possession, and to which he insinuates himself on them, as if by stealth. though they have no other reason than that, so that they often testify that they love or hate someone without knowing the cause. There is, I say, in the inferior faculties of the soul, such a sense of proportions without sensation. Indeed, they neither distinguish the proportion from its terms or what is subject to it, as when we hear some pleasant tune, but do not consider the musicianship apart from the sounds, nor clearly distinguish between different harmonies. For they only notice that they are, and do not know what they are or how they differ. Of course, the ideas of the harmonies, which these inferior faculties of the soul have within themselves, are clearly not known by instinct in their purity, but along with the wrappings of the emanation which is subject to them, that is, of that which is the object of each faculty. Certainly, the faculty of hearing, to use the example of consonant sounds to stand for all, which holds a position very close to the body, was too coarse, and so also unfit to receive the purest idea of proportion, as I shall now immediately explain at greater length. For I now come to the active faculties, which are concerned with the harmonic proportions. For this also is twofold, for either it operates on its own account or in things which are outside itself, in either cause adapting its operations to the proportions or bringing the proportions into them. The former case is indeed like something passive. The latter is beyond argument, occupied in activity. The former, therefore, is again the offspring of the inferior faculties of the soul, the latter of the superior. The former is subject to the powers of nature, the latter to the will of man. The former is plainly strong by the motion of the alteration which it brings to its body, so that it is completely subject to the vital faculty. For our delight in the harmonies of sounds has the character of an experience, in fact, of being anointed or caressed, and hence the philosophers also call it, from its being passive, a response shared between minds and music.
So you see, he's talking specifically right now about the harmonies that we sensually receive from the external universe, right, into our senses, and then the that's passively receiving, but then the active part is of the mind that can ponder the relationships after they're received. So then you could think about the essence of what would be the reason for the proportions being one way or another, congruent or incongruent, dissonant or consonant after the fact, right? So they play with each other.
Okay. However, it is in reality an operation of the soul acting by its natural motion on itself and exciting itself, and it is brought to that not by intention or will, but by natural instinct. And in fact, it has from their very origin the ideas both of the harmonies incorporated into sound and of the feelings of the mind which respond to them, linked together and, so to speak, conflated into one, so that the idea of the harmony is implanted in it only insofar as it delights in it and is something pleasurable, and insofar as it is bound up with the idea of the associated motion. This, I believe, was what Proclus meant above when he declared that the patterns of mathematical things, and so also of harmonies, and much more so, were in the mind intellectually, but in the soul vitally. For similarly, they were also in the faculty of hearing soundly, in the vital faculty of sublunar things radiantly and operatively. That is, they are not the actual pure internal patterns, but representations of them derived from without. However, the fact that we are not only delighted by harmony in music, but also fit the moments of fingers, mouth, feet, and body to it, we now attribute to the animal faculty coupled with the will. But when we also fit the voice to intelligible harmonies, when we study a melodic piece of music, which we have not heard before, in this case, we are using all the highest and lowest faculties. The highest indeed, because we employ both will and intention, but the lowest because we are able to, and because even without understanding of the proportions, we express the ideas of the intervals alone, which have been implanted by nature in music, excluding everything unmelodic and roaming over the melodic intervals alone. Therefore, the harmonic faculties explained up to this point have been breathed out by that essential harmony, God himself, in the act of creation, inasmuch as he is, what is that word?
Existence.
Sense.
Existence and activity. And he has breathed this particle of his own image into all sound, all souls, absolutely, more or less closely. With the lesson, I shall also put an end to this chapter. That's the chapter? That was quick.
That was a quick chapter, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm glad I volunteered for that one.
Well done, Helene.
You're going to be off the hook for a while, but that was a really nice reading, Helen. Good.
Okay.
Now we have
A good
choice.
example, Matthew,
Yeah.
a good example of what was just written there about the higher and the lower order of our perception of things. If we take bird song,
yeah,
you can hear a bird sing. Well, I mean, it's actually suggested that it's one of the ways that we came to understand music. Listening to birds sing, particularly those that sang octaves. Okay, so when you perceive it, when you listen to a bird sing, the lower part, if you like, that Kepler's referencing there is you're simply delighted in the sound. But the higher faculty allows you to understand that in the movement between a note and its octave higher, there is a pattern, which we now know is a doubling of frequency.
Mm. And you have some examples of some birds that do the octave naturally in their natural.
Look, I wish I could. I think one of them is a bird called the bower bird, which is an Australian bird. It's noted for its singing.
Oh, beautiful. Hmm. No,
But
sure.
there are many of them, even crows and magpies.
Mm-hmm.
The ravens out in the west coast of North America have an astonishing ability to produce sound.
Yep.
You're listening to the doom. Where'd that doom come from? Well, it's from the same bird.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I'm sure there's a physical reason for it too. Whatever they're using to activate the sounds will correspond to certain physical laws.
Sure.
And going from one note to, let's say, using the octave as an example, that would involve the ability to vibrate the vocal cords, if I use that description, so that you get a doubling of frequency. And then from there you go to all the other intervals that we use, a tripling, a division into the fractions, seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, I definitely like to get like a repository, a collection of examples, because I tried to find, we when making the little PowerPoint, there's so many examples of visual geometries that occur in turtle shells and all sorts of places in nature visually. But I was trying to find some examples of sounds that also exhibited these geometric harmonies, and I had a tough time. So it would be great to. I wasn't really thinking so much about birds, and I should have been. That was silly. Yeah, that's a good.
Well, it has been. Look, I can't remember who it is who first posited it, and it was posited a while ago. But the idea that everything that we understand about music comes from our interaction with bird sounds originally.
Well, I like that. It's a good hypothesis.
Look, I can't say that it's true necessarily. I just know that there is a theory out there that suggests that, and it's understandable, very understandable.
Yeah. Well, you also found examples of like these ancient flutes, right? From like one that was dug up, and they did some radiocarbon dating and found it to be something like 30,000 years old, and it was the holes were positioned in an equal tempering position. So it was actually, though they didn't study Kepler or anything, they still naturally built the flute to produce resonances that we then recognize are actually in close approximation to the planetary orbits, indicating that this is more than simply just it's more than just a cultural artifact from Western tradition that produces these ratios. It's something a little bit more, there's something more universal under this bubbling under the surface.
And I would suggest that there's resonance.
Mhm.
You know, if you're out in the bush and you're listening to natural sounds, the bird sounds are going to stand out. And, you know, I mean, if you surround yourself with those kinds of sounds, those sounds, like an octave, like a fifth, like a fourth, the consonant intervals, they resonate within us. We're kind of tuned to those, if you like. And hence you would want to reproduce it. You would find a way, even if you don't understand the, you know, the mathematics of the frequencies and anything. It doesn't surprise me at all that 30,000 years ago, there were people on the planet that were trying to reproduce natural sounds, and they found a way to do it through, you know, creating a flute, blowing over it, and then working out where they put their holes in it to reproduce the sounds that they were imitating.
Sure, yeah.
They weren't inventing them from nothing.
Oh yeah. Well, you got these ancient Tibetan bells too, right? That are built according to the octave, the doubling of the resonances, and there's choices made to build the ratios in between the smaller bells.
Yep.
In accordance with certain boundary conditions. I'm sure we'll find this in nearly every culture that we can think of. We'll find the octave and the doubling of the length of the string expressed as an insight that's with certain variations, obviously, because every culture has their own sort of flavor. But there are these constants too that are fun.
Yeah, the whole study of gongs in Asia is a fascinating thing.
Mm-hmm.
On the subject of what Paul was saying, I just mentioned that one of the most famous singers of France in the 60s, 70s, Edith Piaf, was colloquially called the Little Sparrow.
Yeah.
And the biggest Bollywood singer from the 1950s all the way up to, you know, the 21st century, Lata Mangeshkar, was referred as the Nightingale of India. But I want to make some comments showing that this is just one aspect of what Kepler refers to as when he talks about where all these beasts have these melodies, or at some level within them. He describes it as God imprinting his image at a lower level on them as well. And so that same sort of DNA, you can say it's in their DNA. And that same DNA leads to all kinds of mysteries. It leads to whale sounds, for instance, the sounds emitted, which are quite musical, by whales to communicate with each other, and which sonar now interferes with and is causing great grief to them. But at another level, the DNA is what causes birds to fly, you know, thousands of miles at the changing of the season, whales to go from California to Alaska, turtles to come to the sea, deposit their eggs in the sand, and seagulls hovering above, knowing, you know, precisely when those eggs are going to hatch, and then trying to eat most of them. And those little baby turtles knowing that they have to run to the sea to escape. So there are all kinds of things built into the DNA of every creature, I think. And these musical notes and harmonies are just one element of that whole DNA, in my opinion. Kepler is investigating one aspect, the ratios between the planets and the movements and the angles and the harmonies he perceives in them. But that is just one level of unraveling the blueprint of the design of the creator, which we have been doing with science. You know, he's doing some parts, and Newton then explained a bunch of other things, and then Faraday, and then Einstein completely, undermined or sort of undermined the idea that Newton had given us all the answers. And then he himself was shocked by quantum physics. So this is one aspect of the design of the creator, which Kepler, in my view, is unraveling here, describing here. But it also deals with, we've been hearing this argument that science disproves God. What it does actually is show that the creator also carefully designed the creation, and there's all kinds of intelligence built into it. Things like these ratios, things like musical harmonies, things like how he has incorporated them into every creature, and there's an instinctive sort of reaction in those creatures. They know what they have to do without knowing why. just
Yeah,
like we
the
do.
bees didn't go to school to learn geometry to build the hexagons. They just built the hexagons.
So
And Harinder, some recent discoveries. It turns out, I think this was a bunch of researchers who followed a pod of whales that had recently given birth to calves. They've discovered that each of the whales has a name. They actually recognize each other using sound, but each one of the whales has a specific name.
interesting.
A vocalization. Yeah, that's somewhat recent. I read that only a couple of weeks ago, but I was, as soon as I see something like that, I'm fascinated by it, of course.
Yeah, I'd be curious how they conducted that inquiry.
Yeah,
And I agree obviously with your observation too, Harinder, that everything is there in nature for us to discover.
Yeah.
And
But it goes back.
it's not there by accident.
But it goes also to the epistemological concept of representation, meaning a sign with a meaning for a certain species. Okay, the whales having a name through whale sounds. Well, those whale sounds are representation having meaning for those whales. So, of course, I have a little bit of a human-centered representation, but I'm sure that if we have access to the different languages of all the animals, we would have their songs of the earth.
And all of this fits, of course, with some relatively recent studies in consciousness. If you take the Aristotelian view, for example, and the entirety of the human mind exists within the brain and is contained within the brain, and pretty much all mainstream researchers along those lines, neuroscientists, et cetera, convinced that if they simply pull the brain apart, they'll find an internal computer that they can mimic. I mean, Yuval Harari and his whole stupid mob. When, you take Rupert Sheldrake, and he's far from the only one, but the suggestion is that the mind is merely a receiver.
Yeah.
That consciousness is non-local, and that we human beings tap into a, I don't want to call it a universal consciousness, but a consciousness that only we can tap into, and that all animals do this. All living creatures do this to a greater or lesser degree.
Well, let's not be shy. Okay, let's not be shy. Okay, let's use the Keplerian words. After all, it's in the chapters by Kepler. That's why I love so much those 5 words: uncorporeal and unlocalized mode.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So from there, we are not very far from Nous by Anaxagoras. Okay, the cosmic mind.
Yes, actually, I will just add to that a simple idea that is there in Eastern philosophy, that the soul is a particle of God, a spirit, and the mind is a particle of the cosmic mind that was created by the Creator in order to build the universe, and which involves all kinds of sciences. And we are just uncovering, the first 2 or 3 layers of the onion, but there's a very complex design, and that was the mind of the Creator, and we have a tiny bit of that mind. And for instance, if you take Mozart, where was he getting all those? If you saw the movie, apparently he was able to compose entire symphonies or concertos without any drafts. So where was he getting that from? That was his mind communicating with, I'll use the word cosmic mind, uncorporeal, whatever Kwan just said. It's out there, and it communicates with us individually in different ways, so for reasons that are beyond the scope of today's lecture.
Yeah. And Kepler, being a Platonist, just expressed in his own words the 3 supreme form, eidos by Plato: beauty, goodness, and truth. Okay, which are, after all, the supreme form that we can access to from that incorporeal and unlocalized mode. I wouldn't repeat often those 4 words. I truly love them: uncorporeal and unlocalized mode.
Well, I like that idea that Kepler, in his Mysterium Cosmographicum, he spends a lot of time referencing his admiration for Cusa, and Cusa's concept or metaphor of the universe as being likened to a sphere whose center is everywhere. And it's a cool concept, like everywhere you could imagine positioning yourself, it would be as though you're in the center of a sphere. There's no external outside this universe in that view, although it is still bounded by fundamental concepts of sphereness, right? Which is still bounded. The sphere is bounded by its radius and its shell, related to the center, but it's not something that has like any as soon as you put a metric onto it, it becomes sort of you can create a material expression of the sphere, like a bubble. If they say bubbles pop, the sphere is eternal. There's no absolute size for the sphere. It can be as big or as small as your imagination can take you. And it's bounded by qualities, not by some lower order metric that a lot of people get confused by.
Yeah, maybe an educational note here, and I'm coming back to the Phaedo and to the argument by Simmias precisely, which stated that the soul can be the secondary product of the harmony of the parts of the body. Why I want to mention that, because the distinction between the inferior faculties of the soul and the superior faculties of the soul is absolutely vital, because if you are not, let's say, make sensible or make open to the idea that they are timeless forms, we know enough neurobiology nowadays to support the argument of Simmias if the idea of timeless form is not introduced in the mind of a young child from a quite early age, okay? Because if you don't have that idea of uncorporeal and unlocalized modes precisely, it's very easy with the degree of neurobiology that we know now to uphold the idea of Simmias that the soul is the product of the harmony of the bodily parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I'll just add one more thing, Matthew. I think that idea of, I forget the name you used, the guy who said the universe is a sphere and at any point you're in the center. It's a metaphor because we don't know what the shape of the universe is, and a cube may be the best approximation, because even with the finite universe, all we know about it is that its amplitude, its size is just beyond our comprehension. Even in our own solar system, our Earth is very, very tiny, maybe a little pebble, but in the context of the vast reaches of space, Earth is barely a speck of dust at the most. So what is the shape of that universe? It's a safe assumption that it's expanding in all directions, more or less equally. So a sphere is a good approximation, but it's a metaphor, I would say. And therefore you cannot say where the center is because it's so damn big. So
yeah, the JWST telescope is proving that the more they look, the more they're realizing that the finiteness of the universe that they're expecting to find is far more infinite than they believed.
Yeah. Well, I think the very idea, like one thing that we learned from Plato during the Phaedo reading on the immortality of the soul is that it is never a responsible thing, if we love truth, to impose standards of the senses onto matters of metaphysics. So those ideas that pertain to concepts that derive from the sensory apparatus would not be what the true philosopher would impose onto the metaphysical higher domain of reality that bounds the physical reality we live in. So the question then becomes, like, for the nature of the shape of the universe, what if the universe is growing, if it's animated by life? I think it is. I think we all do, and that there's evidence of mind and reason everywhere we look. What's it growing into? What would be it, Harinder, I don't know, have you thought about that?
Well, my understanding is this is, I'm of course influenced by, my readings of Indian Eastern scripture, that in Western science, there was a big bang and a very tiny particle is now expanding, billions upon billions of miles in every direction. And we have no way of verifying in which direction if it is growing more or another direction is growing less. A safe assumption is to say that it's expanding everywhere equally. But we also have the idea that universes, we don't know when things actually began, that the universe has been created and sustained for a while and then destroyed. And for a while again, everything lies in hibernation. and things start again, and the whole cycle repeats itself. And this has happened many times. So beyond that, I can't be more specific to answer the question that you asked. I have no idea of what the shape is, although we have read that this is the physical universe we are seeing, which, as you just made the distinction, what we can perceive from our senses and what may exist at a different level. As an example, in Plato, at the end, Socrates describes certain dimensions that are not perceivable by the eyes of the body and the ears, etc., which is why he counsels withdrawing from it, because the physical senses are full of deceit. They do not show us truth.
Which is interesting that he describes this metaphysical reality in a very sensual way, describing the colors and the sounds of everything in a very sensual which is just an interesting little irony he's planting there too, to think about.
No, the reason for that is because otherwise those higher dimensions would be indescribable in the language that we speak, which is uttered by the tongue, which is a part of the body. And this is everywhere, okay, in scriptures, every scripture, every mythology. It is a way to sort of find an intermediary between what is indescribable and what we can understand. So that's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, I think that epistemologically we have to distinguish what we can observe, what we can imagine, and what we cannot imagine. Okay, because I take a very practical example of the exploration of the universe between the 18th century and nowadays. Okay, till the 18th century, the idea of galaxies were only some imaginary stuff in the mind of philosophers. Okay, until the Hubble telescope, which made the difference between our own Milky Way and galaxy Andromeda, for example. From that moment, it's clear that it's not an object of imagination, but they were a population of stars that are clustered together that we name galaxies. Okay, so in the past, the whole universe was only our solar system, and after that it was the Milky Way, and after that you have many Milky Way, as when it was clear that the Milky Way is a star population distinct from the Andromeda or from other galaxies, for example. Now we have clusters of galaxies, and after that we have super clusters of galaxies. So we reach to that level of imagination and of observation, but ultimately is an object of the mind. Okay, maybe that we can imagine as a universe as complex as possible, and because of that imagination precisely, and going back to Kepler, you have the intelligible harmonic proportions that will be always in advance of many centuries compared to the sensible stuff that we can imagine, that we can perceive directly or through our instruments.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
I'll be a pedant here too, Quan. We knew about the Andromeda Galaxy long before the Hubble telescope was launched.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
In terms of
the Andromeda Galaxy was discovered by Earth-based satellites, not by the Hubble telescope. I remember well when it was announced when I was a little kid. I remember seeing the pictures.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, I'm just being a pedant. I'm just being a pedant.
No, you're right, Paul. But in terms of clear demonstration that it's a population of star that is really outside of our own Milky Way.
And what the Hubble did was show you that there was an awful lot more than just the galaxy, the nearby galaxy of Andromeda.
Exactly.
But there's a female astronomer, I forgot her name now, in the 1928 or so, who was the first to prove that indeed there are these other galaxies that are not, because they knew that there were spiral formations.
Maybe it was Stoddard, maybe.
I forget her name. But yeah, I mean, it expanded our sense of what is space and time by so many billions of light years, not even a century ago, right? Before that, everyone thought the universe was so much smaller, as you pointed out, Juan.
Okay, exactly. And in the 18th century, for Immanuel Kant, it was an object of imagination. We have to give him a little bit of a tribute. Immanuel Kant was capable to imagine an island of star outside the Milky Way. But of course, at the time, he was in no way capable to prove it by direct observation.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that's also useful that I've discovered in looking through Kepler and this whole battle, this clash of the two divergent things called Western science, is like Kepler is completely suppressed in the West. Nobody reads Kepler. And one thing that emerged out of the destruction of people's awareness of what Kepler actually did, and also his followers like Leibniz and Gauss and Riemann, who all carried forth his work into higher and higher degrees of resonance with reality. You've got this opposing current that's been trying to subvert science, out of which emerged recent concepts like the Big Bang. It itself is not something which is caused by Western science. It's actually, if anything, when you look into it, it's actually a perversion, a derailment of Western science masquerading as Western science as a label, but it is actually anti-Western science.
It's postulated by a Jesuit priest.
Well, that was a beginning, okay? But once again, we had already that discussion before, okay? I think that there's nothing wrong to posit a beginning in the condition, at the condition that you say that it's a cycle and not the absolute beginning.
Well, they didn't do that. They posed it in a way that imposed a limitation onto metaphysics.
Well, you're speaking of
you're
speaking of Georges Lemaitre, I suppose.
Yes, yeah, and all of those who promoted that line of thinking, yeah.
Okay, but I think that he was a little bit obsessed to prove the idea of written in the Genesis that there was an absolute beginning, but he was a little bit clumsy epistemologically, because that would not be contrary to the idea of God to say that in our cosmic cycle there is a beginning, but the true beginning is infinite. That would not be contrary to his idea of God. He was clumsy, I think.
I think he was sloppy. I don't. Yeah, he was definitely ideological. That's for sure.
He Hannes Alvin recounted meeting Georges Lemaitre, and Lemaitre recounted in 1937 that what he was trying to do was reconcile his Augustinian view of the universe with modern science. So it's it definitely ideology preceded his science.
But I would say he would have been capable to satisfy his ideology with a little bit more imagination, with just one phrase. It's the beginning of a cycle.
On that point, Matthew, what is it that you mean? I just cited the Big Bang Theory because that is sort of widely known. So what is your understanding of how this was a perversion of science? That part I'm not aware of. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I just shared a link to a documentary. I was invited in 2008 to take part with a grouping of 6 individuals when I was still volunteering with the LaRouche organization. And they put together a 1 hour, the challenge was to do a 1 hour introduction to Kepler, which would also showcase the cult of Newton, the political cult of Newton himself, kind of like you had a political cult later on of Charles Darwin. And some of the players and what was used to basically take the discoveries made by Kepler and also a few others like Huygens and Leibniz and repackage them under a new branding, extracting the soul of the discoveries in the form of the Newtonian worldview, the whole Newtonian system.
But are you saying that Newton's discovery of gravity and other laws that was also plagiarized from Kepler?
Yeah. You don't discover things by having fruit fall on your head. Yeah, it's there was a complete political myth created around him for political reasons. Yeah, it's a very interesting line that's often overlooked by people trying to make sense of geopolitics.
But the
I saw a relevant
light
cartoon.
and
Sorry, go on, Harinder.
Light, electromagnetism, electricity, these were discoveries made by other scientists later on after Kepler, right?
Well, there was a
so the
fitter who
same
was
process, the same process took place with electricity and magnetism. Who are the key player who's in the discoveries of electricity?
Stephen Gray.
Charles Coubertin Coulomb,
Ben Franklin gets a mention.
Pierre-Marie Ampère, and Wilhelm Edward Weber. Now, now all of these are using, they're using action at a distance. And and if you study seeing magnetism in in your science books today, either in high school or university, who do you study? You study James Clerk Maxwell. And what did if you pick up a copy of Maxwell's his treatise on electricity and magnetism, and you read the introduction, he says, "I stole Wilhelm Edward Weber's work. I adjusted a few of the equations, and as a result, my stuff violates Newton's third law of every action has an equal and opposite reaction. But that doesn't matter because the stuff sort of works." And it's this idea of this stuff sort of works, which is great for doing engineering up to a certain point until you reach the limits. But then if you want to go further, the only thing you can do is to go back to the very origins of that hack adjustment and figure out where the original source was and start with the original source again, which is what the Brazilian physicist André Torres Aziz has done. His life work was essentially bringing to the fore, first in Portuguese and then into English, the collected works of Coulomb, Ampère, and Weber. Which are originally in French and in German, but which are not even well known by French people because the collected works of Coulomb were sort of haphazardly done, and there's lots of missing documents that finally were put together by Assis. And Weber's works, no one knows them. His works on electricity, no one knows them. He's known as an amazing experimentalist, but not, and as having co-invented the telegraph with Gauss, but not that in fact he was the first person to postulate the nucleus for an atom, and he's the first person to derive the velocity c, what we call today the speed of light in a vacuum. It's not in a vacuum, but that's another story. So the point is that what Matt was describing with respect to Kepler and Newton, you reorganize Kepler's equations and produce a new set of equations. You call that gravity, but now gravity no longer has any of this harmonic field that is implicit in the way Kepler did his work. So so literally, as I think as Matt describes it, the soul has been taken out of the science, and now you're back to a dead universe.
Yeah,
where
exactly.
things are randomly interacting. I think you could say the same with respect to Weber's work being taken and reorganized by Maxwell.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the mathematics taking the high ground rather than the soul.
But it's not as if Johannes Kepler wasn't a brilliant mathematician. It's not as if Johannes Kepler didn't spend 40 years of his life working through Tycho Brahe's tables day in and day out. I mean, there were no computers, there was no internet, there were no database, there was no electronic databases in those days. Everything had to be done in your mind, and with and they didn't even have these nice beautiful Japanese uniball, sorry, I don't have my camera on, these beautiful uniball pens. You know, they had to write with goose quill and so on and so on. It's hard to write.
Yeah,
But they had nothing.
Yeah, but maths is not the problem. but maths as the master is the problem.
Okay, fine. Exactly.
And Paul, I know why I say Hubble. It was a slip of tongue. It's not the telescope. It was the astronomer in the 1920s who proved that Andromeda was outside our Milky Way.
Yeah, he wasn't a great fan of the Big Bang Theory either.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't even believe in the Hubble expansion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was not him who proved it that there's an expansion. It was another one called Vesto Slipher. Or Slipher.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce it. S-L-I-F-E-R. Maybe it's the name you're looking for, Matt. Vesto Slipher.
Is he the
No,
one?
no, it was the Jesuit. It was the priest.
It was a Jesuit, Georges
Oh, yeah.
Lemaitre. Okay, it was another
Yeah,
line of
Georges
discussion.
Lemaitre definitely. He studied in Jesuit school as a kid. I don't know if he became a member of the order. Maybe you know more than I do.
But you see, that's a direct demonstration that when you're too ideological, you're not even capable to see that it would have been much, much more elegant to present your ideology in the more subtle form.
Well, these people, some of them are pretty fanatical, right?
Well,
I mean,
fanatical.
look at the Dominicans that went after Galileo.
Yeah, I sure.
Yeah.
I mean, they did a serious number on the reputation of the church.
Yeah, sure. But maybe I'm naive, but I think you can be passionate, which is a nicer word for fanatical, and retain some common sense.
I guess the problem is you're dealing with
in theory, Quan, in theory.
Yeah. Yeah, in theory, maybe.
If I understand you correctly, Matthew, you are saying that the Big Bang Theory is basically a fake because all these former scientists, including Kepler, for instance, what he's propounding is kind of what I said earlier. He's merely unraveling the blueprint of God. He's not trying to postulate when the universe started or anything of that sort. And so this Big Bang thing was invented as a way of sort of, proposing a atheistic science or something. Is that correct? Am I understanding you properly?
Well, there's two angles to take this from. Like, one, you do have in the Western Christian doctrine an idea of the start, right? Let there be light. So you do have like a linearity of nothingness then somethingness that was sort of there as a structure. But then you had different approaches to think about that. Like, you had the idea of thinking about God as a poet, right? God as a creative living poet versus God as a tyrant versus God as, like there's a whole dispute about what would be the nature of God such that his essence would flow through the materially discoverable creation that we are made in the image of, right? And out of that sort of tension and you see that tension really come up beautifully in the Leibniz versus Clarke correspondences, which deal with the different hypotheses about the nature of God and creation. One being the Keplerian Platonic worldview expressed by Leibniz, in opposition to Clarke, who is one of the three big handlers of Isaac Newton. And they basically do a showdown towards the end of Leibniz's life. And this is like really, maybe we'll even read these 6 letters back and forth at some point soon, but it's worth it. The other thing is I think the actual evidence in the 20th century just proves that the model of the Big Bang that Hubble also denied is important, that's being suppressed, like the fact that galaxies with very extremely divergent redshifts. There's a fellow named Halton Arp who is a leading astrophysicist and a student directly of Edwin Hubble himself. I delivered a long lecture on Halton Arp's discoveries and how he was attacked by the modern Inquisition. But he put forth in 1966 an encyclopedia of peculiar galaxies, and you can get it online even now. And he's got hundreds of images of galaxies that have very divergent redshifts, but that are connected with material filamentary structures, which would be impossible if these galaxies that are hundreds or thousands of light years of separation, according to the naive reading of redshift as being the Doppler effect. If that were true, there could not be a material connection, but there is. And he also deals with quasars and what are actually quasars, according which it's very, very interesting. But basically,
the technical terms are redshifts extrinsic or intrinsic?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
And so if they're extrinsic, it's about that's the idea of the expanding universe. It's simply nothing to do with the actual structure of the objects themselves.
Yes.
It has simply they're simply moving away from us, and they're moving away so fast that the light is redshifted.
Yes.
If they're, on the other hand, intrinsic, then there's something about these objects that means that the redshifts that there's different and the redshifts are different. And what gets even better is that the redshifts in Halt and Arb's work is that the redshifts are quantized.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the proportions between these different quanti are the same that you find in quantum mechanics. So for me, this is the most mind-blowing thing in the universe, that you have the same quantization effects in subatomic physics as you do in transgalactic objects.
Hey, the unified theory.
So obviously, once you see these at these hugely different scales, the same things coming up, the same numbers coming up, then you immediately ask yourself, if you're a curious nature, then there must be something about the universe which has this kind of stuff built into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, how to make sense of all this requires another Kepler, who is able to bring forth all this.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe Kepler
But it's not by accepting the 1930s introduction of chance with a capital C, replacing God with a capital G as the driving force in the universe, that you're going to make these discoveries.
Yeah, but it's not the notion of fractals reflect that idea of harmonic proportions precisely.
Sure.
That the fractal.
The idea of fractals is that things are self-similar at different scales, but that doesn't. But you still need the generating key at the different scales. How does this work?
Yes, that would be a deeper answer.
There are some deeper sets of knowledge which we don't yet grasp.
Well,
And no need to get mystical about it. It's we're talking about physical objects.
well, that's where I will agree and disagree with you. You pointed out a very important connection between the quantum world and the extragalactical stuff. But that linkage that you then refer to, that there is something deeper, that deeper is given. There's probably one sentence in the Gospels that should be taken literally and is never taken literally, and that is that the kingdom of heaven is neither here nor there, it is within you. And this also links to what Socrates says in Phaedo. You're not going to find these higher dimensions through any mechanism of the body. That includes scientific instrumentation, because that's built with the senses of the body. You're going to find it by gathering the soul within itself, practicing mystical meditation. So I agree with you to some point, and I also disagree with you, because this patchwork of the universe is so complex. Maybe 100,000 Keplers would not be able to completely unravel it.
I don't think anyone ever is going to. I don't think anyone is ever going to completely unravel any of this stuff, but certainly advances can be made.
Yes, and that is a quest which involves the things that Socrates counsels against. So I'll just leave it at that. He says, "Get the hell out of this body," is what he counsels, and that is pretty much what salvation generally means, in my understanding.
Well, Harinder, I mean, if that's what you took out of the 3-week reading session of the Phaedo, man, you got to review the Phaedo. You were not reading along with Socrates, dude.
I was reading. I would disagree with you, because that is exactly what he says. He says the highest goal of a philosopher. Why is a philosopher always seeking death? He's seeking death because there is nothing in this place that is ultimately worth what the philosopher is seeking. He's seeking to go to the place where truth, beauty, and goodness exist at a permanent level. Where
what is he doing in the interim before he gets to that moment of releasing the soul from the shackles of the body?
He's counseling his friends to pursue the same path. He, for instance, in that conversation of Evenus, who complains that Socrates is writing poems to outshade him, he says, "Is Evenus not a philosopher?" And then he says to Simmias and Cebes, "Are you guys not philosophers? Meaning, aren't you seeking the same thing that I am seeking?"
What I'm saying is, what is he doing in the course of the decades of life? Is he just always just yearning for that moment of death, or is he spending his life in a qualitative way?
His primary goal, he keeps repeatedly, he says, is seeking death. He's always seeking death. However, he's also performing the tasks that have been given to him by the guardians that he admits we are all under.
Okay, yeah. What are those tasks?
His destiny, teaching other people the best that he can. Your destiny is to engage in these forums and explore history which has been suppressed and science which has been suppressed, and you are following it. Everybody is following whatever task has been.
What you just said is exactly what I wanted you to say. That was perfect. I mean, because his point in life is to teach you to awaken the spark and love of truth in other people, right? To make discoveries, to advance and to perfect themselves and help others. Like that's the whole.
But that is just one part. What he says is that the highest goal is to reach the point where you are done with all of that exploration, because there is this poetic statement. I don't know which British poet says, we will arrive at the end of our explorations and find ourselves at the point where we once began. I don't know the name of the poet, but you guys probably know it. I don't know if it's Blake or somebody else. So those are mystical references in poetry.
Yes.
You can go on exploring this universe. The universe is one day going to be destroyed. And so you're pursuing something.
That's a big assumption. That's a big assumption you're imposing onto the universe. That's a lot of, maybe.
But I would like,
on the hubris.
I would like to propose something, okay? Maybe the death is not the death in the sense of inexistence, but the death to the life in the cave. And the life is the life precisely centered on the timeless dimension of beauty, goodness, and truth, which is the true life. And once again, it's not a question of localization, okay? And I'm repeating Kepler's word. It's about more the uncorporeal and unlocalized mode, but still, it doesn't mean that the corporeal mode is to be rejected, but you are simply beyond that mode.
As he says, I'm not going to kill myself because that is against the law.
Exactly.
Talking about a physical law, he's talking about the law of the universe. He doesn't want to offend those guardians, those gods. Yeah. So he's going to do his job, his duty assigned to him, but his objective is nothing to do with this place. His objective is to be done, and to be done with that by ridding himself of all bodily desires, ambitions, etc., etc.
Yes. But I would say that someone who is above that lower dimension would not disturb him so much that he has to absolutely leave the place. You know the nuance that I try to bring here.
Yes, you did, Bodhisattva and Buddha. Yes, I remember that.
Yes. But I would say that it wouldn't always be two modes of perception of reality in us human beings, okay? Those who want to live absolutely, and those who would say that if you're in the timeless mode, or once again, I repeat the expression I love, the uncorporeal and unlocalized mode, you can be in the body, but it's not a disturbance by itself.
Okay, here's one last, I'm obviously, this is not an argument we're going to settle, and I'm obviously Matthew has very strong views about it. I have different views. just let's go back to Genesis, where the eating of a fruit containing the knowledge of good and evil led to expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the state of innocence, and almost a permanent expulsion, which, it's doubtful that too many human parents would permanently exile their children for a single act of disobedience. But it is a fundamental thing, the knowledge of good and evil. To me, that's an association of life in the physical dimension. It's a play between the good and the evil. I think Socrates himself has this metaphor of the soul chained to a chariot with two wild horses pulling in different directions, the good one and the evil one. And so he says, you're always going to be caught in this conflict. And so the wise man, he counsels, will want to get out of this situation. He will want to return to that Eden where he was in a state of innocence, above the knowledge of good and evil. So I think there's a connection between these ideas, but obviously I'm pursuing a very difficult argument, and
But
it's not important. Yeah.
No, but I think you're right to mention that, because I think that the primary Garden of Eden is precisely the innocence of a child, but the expansion is the beginning of the epistemological journey, and that you would return to that Garden of Eden, but not as an innocent and ignorant child, but as a wise person. And that is the epistemological journey.
Yes, possibly. Yes, I think there's a lots of currents to that effect. Also, that the creator wants to inflict this educational process, even though it may be difficult, it may be tyrannical, but it is possibly designed to instill in the soul a desire to return to a place of innocence and no conflict, having learned from the experience of conflict and strife in the physical universe.
Yeah, you know better than me, Harinder, that the wise man is childlike, but that childlike characteristic of the wise man is not the ignorance of the child.
Yes, yes. So there was a purpose. There was definitely a purpose why that was done. It was not an accident that the fruit was there and the snake was there to tempt and so on. This was the design of the creator, that this expulsion would take place and the descent into the knowledge of good and evil would happen, and we would spend a long time traveling in distress before we would be able to find our way home.
Yeah, the rebels are the soul of the earth.
The what?
The rebels, those who enter into rebellion, are the soul of the earth.
Well, they're also the ones cast out.
Of course, but if you enter into rebellion, you would be cast out, but you would conquer your true reality.
Well, one hopes.
Can we go back as far as we possibly can here just for a second?
Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, all of the creation mythologies of all of the civilizations that we're aware of pretty much start from the same position. The Egyptian, I think it's Maat, the Ein Sof of the Jewish Kabbalah. I can't think of the names of the Mayan description or the Chinese description, but they posit a beginning in which there was nothing, no thing. Complete indistinction. Everything was totally the same. Now, as a way of, an image of this, just imagine a circle. Okay, just for the sake of the description that I'm going to give you, imagine a circle in which nothing is different. Everything is essentially the same. Let's call that the mind of God.
Yeah.
And then for whatever reason, God decides that this is, not what he wants, that he wants to create something. He creates the first distinction. So if you take that circle, just imagine a line drawn through the middle. The other interesting part of this one too is that the minute you do that, you don't create two distinctions, you create three.
Yes.
Let's say you create the A side of the line, the B side of the line, but you also have the line that joins them. And from there, every distinction that happens thereafter participates in that original no thing and is connected to that no thing.
Okay.
Now, as a metaphor, as an analogy for the mind of God and the way in which everything in the universe is connected, I find it fascinating that you find that at the heart of, so far as I know, every single mythology of creation that we have on planet Earth, including Australian Aboriginals, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
And they're not noted for their scientific descriptions, et cetera, but the descriptions that they give fit exactly the same image. As I say, I'm not sure of the names of all of these things, but I'm reasonably certain that I'm correct here when I say that every mythology that has a cosmology of creation starts with exactly that. So the discussion earlier, Harinde, you were talking about, the Big Bang and the explosion, et cetera. What is all the material in the universe expanding into? If you look at all of the material part of the universe, the phenomenal universe, if you like, as merely a collection of distinctions, ever increasing, the division continues left, right, and center, et cetera, but everything is still connected, then what we are expanding into is that original mind of God, the no thing that was there before everything else, that always was and always will be there. I just find that an interesting metaphor, and I find it fascinating that this is at the root of all cosmology and mythologies around the planet. However they describe them and whatever conclusions they come to from there, they start from the same position. And there is the hint that their understanding of this idea comes from prior ancient knowledge. That's a whole other discussion, of course.
Yes.
Well,
Yes. But
Socrates talked about prior knowledge, which we are recollecting, so it's there in what we.
it's there. It's
Yeah.
there.
Oh, I mean,
It's
it fits in with everything we've talked about, in terms of, the immortality of the soul and the non-locality of consciousness and everything like that. It fits entirely within that frame.
Well, I'd say it's definitely a lot more reasonable to take that line that you just outlined than the school of thinkers who try to impose existence onto non-existence.
Yes.
Which is
Yes,
problematic.
and it's a question of vocabulary, because if we replace nothing, if we put a dash between no and thing, nothing can be being, okay? And once you start the division is becoming. So it's once again the dialectics between being and becoming.
Yeah. There's even an interesting, I don't want to call it numerological math, but there's an interesting numbers thing here.
Yeah.
With that metaphor that I've just given you, the circle, the line between it, you create that division, you've created three things. So in terms of numbers, you go from 1 to 3, not 1 to 2.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And it has ties into, Trinitarian thinking. I mean, the Christian Trinity. I wish I could remember the three. I'm sure, Quan, you'll be able to pick up on this. The Greek Trinity, Gnosos, knowledge,
Well,
wisdom.
It's there in Timaeus. I mean, if you want to see the origins of even the arguments for the early Christian Trinity, read Plato's Timaeus, which was used by all of the fathers of the church, who were of this view, including Origen, from the Library of Alexandria, the early church father pre-Nicaea. But all that to say,
to some extent, we're even moving back into that area, Matthew, in terms of computer science. And what I mean by that is that we live in a, dare I say it, a horrendous digital world at the moment, which is imposing all sorts of restrictions on us left, right, and center. But in one area of computer science, there is the, I don't want to call it a discovery, they've been working on it for years. It's the creation of an analog computer.
Yeah, that's
which
important.
Seems to offer much more real potential than mere digital binary computers.
Yes, absolutely, 1000%.
And
right.
That's a move back in a certain sense to the idea of a Trinitarian way of looking at the world rather than the binary way of looking at the world.
Yes.
Yes. And Paul, just to come back to the idea that you cannot go from 1 to 2, but 1 to 3. Here is the perfect illustration of that.
Yeah.
Okay. You cannot go from 1 to 2, but you can go to 1 to 3 necessarily, because you have the white and the black, but you also have the circle, which encompasses both of them.
And if you hold that up again, just hold that up again.
Which side, the 1 or the 3?
No, the 2. Okay, the description that I gave before of the circle which you cleave, you think of it as a line down the middle. Okay, so it's the unifying surface that connects the two. Well, where the white and the black, I'll call them little tadpoles, never mind the circles, where they join, that's that
Exactly.
reference. Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing that you're saying. It's the same thing that you're saying, yes.
No, absolutely, and that's why that's one of the well, that's at the core of the Parmenides paradox. Okay, if
Yeah.
you go back, if we go back to the Western tradition, that's the Parmenides paradox, and Plato gave the solution, and Kepler developed that solution.
I'll also draw attention to something that I wrote in the chat there that was pretty useful from my point of view. I'm not going to endorse everything that Nassim Haramein talks about in his physics, but for those people like me who have no formal background in science, and I did study biology for a few years, but physics in particular, the Resonance Science Foundation offer a free science course. There are about 5 modules they add to it now and again, but it's totally free. And whilst Nassim is to some degree caught up with Big Bang stuff, he tries to refute an awful lot of it. He's trying to create a unifying grand theory and everything like that, claims to have done so. He does at least have a more open mind than most people in that area. And the parts of the units that you find in there will cover things like the geometry that we've been talking about in relation to Kepler, not necessarily using Kepler as an example, but I'm talking about the how do you derive, you know, the sorts of things that we were asked to derive, and, you know, I cheated using a protractor, etc., etc. How you come to understand the geometry of the universe. And I'll make the final comment on that in my metaphor, my description of the circle with the line in it. If you regard that as the act of creation, that is an act of geometry right there.
No, exact. And I have to admit that I play with the geometry as suggested by Kepler between the 2 items and the soul, and I was too lazy to use a compass. I used my finger, and I imagined the different spot for the vertex. And it's true that there is something within the soul that would give you the answer where you play with the circles, so to create the intersection to get the vertices you need, okay, either 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9. And anyway, I read that Harmonici Mundi long ago, and I have to admit that, Matt, it's a very good idea to make us read it again, that text together, because it's a really extraordinary metaphysical book.
Yeah, it's super good.
Yeah, let's do that.
And it's one of the only things, it's one of the only parts of Kepler's works that you don't need to have like a physical, because it really helps with Kepler to have a monochord physically there to experiment with, and a whiteboard, and, you know, that's the best of the best, but we can't do that. So the book 4 is a wonderful way to at least get a taste of the essence of Kepler. What I'll say, just because I have to, we have to wrap it up because I have to drive to Hawkesbury, an hour away at this hour, to help my uncle with a bit of a crisis in his house. But so what I would recommend would be for people to, in between these reading sessions, I'm going to continuously put out little challenges like we've been doing, to continue exploring or investigating the construction of the Pentagon. And part of this will involve trying to figure out what will be, like, let's say you have a side of a rectangle whose side is 1 and the other side is 2. What would be the side of the diagonal, right? That will obviously take you into the Pythagorean theorem. So you'd have to figure out, well, why is the Pythagorean theorem true? You can't use the formula if you haven't proven why the theorem is true. A² + B² = C². What does that mean? How must Pythagoras himself have been thinking thousands of years ago when he discovered that you have a common area when you take the square of the radius of any triangle, and you compare that area that comes by squaring the diagonal, or the diameter, to the addition of both of the shorter sides of a right angle triangle of any size. It's a universal proof. So we'll have to explore what is that proof, which is doable. There's a few of them, and actually a fun fact: President Garfield, just to get across of the high quality of mind of statesmen of the past that's disappeared in our modern age of mediocrity in the West. President Garfield was an accomplished mathematician who discovered himself 3 unique physical proofs for the Pythagorean theorem before he was killed. Interesting side note. But so we'll want to do that as we move towards the discovery of what is the side of the pentagon that equally divides a circle into 5 equal segments, right? We'll have to look at that. You can't avoid the Pythagorean theorem proof. I'll throw a couple of other things too in the Telegram group that will involve me asking people to, now that you've discovered the side of the construction of the triangle and the square and of the hexagon, what will, if the radius is 1 of the circle, what would be the side of the square that you now create mathematically? So what would that be? What about the side of the triangle? What would that be? What about the side of the octagon? So we're just gonna be demystifying numerology a little bit, because there's people who get a little bit too into the power of number and they forget about the fact that number is a shadow of these qualities that are embedded in the fabric of nature. And then from there, we'll be able to open up the door to other discoveries, but we have to go through a few of these simple things first.